Good morning. Um, this is Dr. Obachashaka, and this is another Dr. Obachashaka show. I hope that people have been getting something useful from this show. Peace to you, Brother Ogawa. I've seen you lined up there for quite a while. So I hope people have got some useful knowledge from this show. I certainly enjoyed doing the last show with Professor Menu Ampin. The topic, as you recall, was the real Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I thought that that was an extremely good discussion, and I hope people got a lot out of it. And as we've noted, Menu Ampin is the foremost authority on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, specifically because he orients him within the correct historical context of him being a revolutionary. And almost all writers on King take him out of that context, both black and white. Very few that acknowledge his revolutionary orientation. And this is extremely important for our people who are constantly, observing his legacy and have great respect for him. But if they have a distorted picture of him, then they don't really understand the message that he left us in full, only in part. The comments on the show on Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, they come under the show itself, were interesting. One in particular I found real interesting was the comment by one viewer that King wasn't a revolutionary. And he didn't say why, but he implied it based on his love life and being nonviolent. And so I posted a reply suggesting that he and others needed to go back and look at the previous show, because the last show deliberately didn't cover the revolutionary orientation of King because we had already covered it. We just briefly mentioned it. But just to briefly note, there's all kinds of evidence that King was a revolutionary. They didn't assassinate him because he was kissing the system's behind. But that isn't the best proof. The best proof is his program and what he tried to put into effect and called for, which was his anti-capitalism, which is a word you don't hear from hardly anybody. Capitalism is usually left alone when people are doing an analysis of what's wrong in this country. Watch the major media, and you don't see capitalism being criticized because the major media is owned by capitalism. So King was an anti-capitalist as a student. He read Marx and said he agreed with his analysis of capitalism. He wasn't a Marxist. There are a lot of reasons for that, but he saw that capitalism is a system that makes the rich rich and the poor poor. And then King was anti-racist. And so when you link anti-capitalism to anti-racism, and then also apply it not only to the United States, but the globe, then you have a profound orientation around his revolutionary thinking. And King put forward ideas on how transformation could occur in this country, and it was under the category of restructuring the country. And that meant a transformation of this country away from capitalism to one that would have an equal distribution of wealth. And I don't know if he thought about it, power. And he was also talking about a reorientation of the country's values away from savage racism and materialism and generally anti-human approach to a humanistic system. So he took a very strong stand that lost him allies, that brought a lot of criticism down on his head, that left him with the Johnson administration angry with him, and probably more than angry with him. So by the end of his life, political life, King, and his life, King didn't have the broad support that he had before because he took a stand on principle. So it's important. I stressed this before. King and Malcolm reached the same conclusion, that this country needed to be restructured. And that is a significant transformation in the direction of the two lines of struggle in Black history in the United States, that of nationalism and so-called integration, which King was not, which we covered in this show. But it meant that two wings of the struggle had converged. And by the end of their lives, they were singing out of the same hymn book. I have a speech I give, King and Malcolm, two who were one and didn't even know it, because Malcolm didn't live long enough to see King's evolution, and King may well have come to appreciate a lot of the agreement that him and Malcolm had, though they didn't agree on everything. So the discussion of King, I thought, was in depth and very good. And we again extend our sympathies to Brother Menu Ampim for the loss of his mother. And I appreciate him coming on the show, especially grieving as he was and still is. And it should be noted with King, took a real stand on the issue of peace and the issue of being opposed to imperialism, especially the war in Vietnam. And while it was mentioned, it needs to be stressed, his wife took that stand a lot earlier than him. Of course, the consequences for the wife taking the stand in him were different. For him, given what he symbolized, it meant power coming down on your head. But the fact that Coretta took that stand as a college student and was active in the peace movement the whole time of the freedom movement indicated her global consciousness. And again, it indicated why she was married to King, and King was married to her. Last week, I started a new edition to the show, and this edition has to do with doing some brief news clips on relevant news that you need to know. And I'll be extending this much further. Today, I only have two, but in the future, I'll probably have a few more. I think this is good because it enables people to keep up on some things that they may have missed. And then, of course, knowing you all who do the chat. And by the way, Lao Tzu, how you doing, brother? And give me a call because there's something I want to ask you to do. So people like Lao Tzu and Ogawa and others have a lot of good insight and input for this show, and probably up on a lot of current events. But just in case you missed something, but you probably haven't missed this, but it's for the benefit of everyone that watches the show. I took a clip from the Sunday, January 16th, New York Times issue. Sunday magazines and newspapers are basically good for the garbage can. I don't even know why I open them, but every now and then you find something interesting. But in this particular New York Times issue last Sunday, there was an article, the subtitle of which dealt with Trump's unprecedented meddling in the census account. This is real important here. And of course, this was his administration's meddling under his direction. This is important because the meddling into the census account has to do with what is really firing up the right wing in this country, a sector of whites. It was in large part behind this notion of the January 6th Stop the Steal thing, where some actually believed the election was stolen. Others simply believed that if blacks vote, it's illegal. And they're doing everything they can to use the law to minimize your vote, going back again to the second post-Reconstruction themes following the first post-Reconstruction. So all of this is the effort of whites in this country, particularly the hard right, but a significant number of whites to hold on to power. And one of the ways is through the census count. And so basically what the Trump administration was pushing for towards the end of his administration was to change the formula for determining the number of House seats. And in doing that, changing the formula that would lead to a reduction of the count of certain people, that is, immigrants of color specifically. And so this was designed so that when it comes to gerrymandering and generally under the census, simply doing a count for House seats, for example, the count would reduce the number of people of color. Particularly what Trump wanted to do was to remove from the count immigrants in this country who are not citizens, and many of whom are people of color. And in doing that, then that would affect the formula for picking members of the House of Representatives, which has already been stacked in the favor of whites through gerrymandering at the state level. So this was his objective, to exclude non-citizens from the population count, when in fact the population count is a count for the whole population of the country. And of course, this is based on the knowledge that the demographics are shifting in this country and soon whites will be a minority. So this is just one of many measures used to forestall white numerical dominance in this country, which is in decline and will be a minority by 2044, 2045 or sooner. So this is one note. Now, according to the New York Times, this move was resisted by Census Bureau officials. However, Trump put into positions of power people who were pushing for this shift in the census count. So according to the New York Times, this was resisted. The second news item that I wanted to mention, and it's also a congratulations. I want to extend congratulations to the people of Barbados and to its great Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, for having 100% sweep in this election, which was an election for the Parliament and, of course, the Prime Ministership of Barbados, which is the government of their country. They had swept the first election when they removed a corrupt government, the only corrupt government Barbados has ever had, and that was a clean sweep. And this was a clean sweep. And as you know, my wife's a Barbadian, So I got to hear and watch on her cell phone the campaigning. And it was some brilliant campaigning. And the opposition was angry because she called for early elections. Well, that's the opposite. That's the option that you have under a parliamentary system. And I think any time she picked for reelection, she was going to win. And so they even went to court to try and block this, and the court threw this objection out because it was clear they were going to lose. Anytime you lose by 100%, you got to be doing some stuff that's really wrong, because Barbados, small island, and everybody knows everybody. So if your stuff is good, people know it. If it isn't, they know it. And so Prime Minister Mia Mottley ran a principal campaign, didn't mention a lot the wrongdoing of the party that she replaced, but enough to just remind people that they had garbage litter in the streets, that they didn't have a bus service, that a lot of money just wasn't being used for what it should be used for. So, but the main thing is she ran on her program. And this is what I really want to compliment both Prime Minister Mia Mottley and the people of Barbados and the leadership that she has as a part of her party for doing a number of things. One is very effectively managing the anti-COVID campaign. And the proof of the pie is in the pudding, and the pudding shows that she's been able to keep in her government, and particularly her Minister of Health. And, Barbadians are highly educated. They got some real smart people, But the difference is we have real smart people all over the world. Some of them just are crooked as a pretzel. And in Barbados, they're basically honest, And so I want to compliment the government of Mia Mottley, people of Barbados, for carrying out an effective anti-COVID campaign that has kept the infection rate in Barbados and the death rate low. And they've taken some very important measures to guarantee that. Prime Minister Mia Mottley was able to get injections for her people. And, most countries of color have not been able to even get the injections. But that's because she cares about her people, and she is also an organizer. She doesn't play around. Another thing that Prime Minister Mia Mottley and her government have done, and she's a Pan-Africanist, and so, which means a person who believes in the unity of Africa and African people, a subject we'll be dealing with today. Want to congratulate her and her government and her people for having created political and economic ties with African states. And this is designed to have some economic benefit for the people of Barbados. But it's being done because she doesn't have a colonial mindset. Another achievement that she has and is continuing to carry out is providing housing for Barbadians, more housing. Another achievement is that when she came into office, the bus service, such as existed, was in shambles. And she has created a national bus service. I won't go into the details, but it was very creative how she did it. Got all these brand new buses in Barbados. How she did it was a sign of a good organizer. In Africa, the Caribbean, and in Asia, and all the world of color, people thrive or try to or survive on small business. And very often they don't thrive because they can't get loans. And the loans usually go to either the money goes to the businesses run by government or what they call in Swahili, Bwana Kubwas, the big shots. But what she's done is set up a program for providing loans for small businesses. And usually when people in Africa and the Caribbean, Asia go for these loans, they need to have credit, they need to have some kind of income. That's why they're going for the loan. And so these loans are being provided on good faith, the government's faith in the borrower, not their credit rating or their income. And Prime Minister Mia Mottley and her government have set up a design for a African Barbadian cultural center. It's being built by the same architect that built the Center for African American Art and Culture in Washington, D.C., the best architect in the world, an African. This is a smart move, as well as indication of the identity of Mia Mottley and her government. That is, that they identify with Africa and their African cultural roots. But it's also a smart move because it's a way of providing another distinctive thing in Barbados that will draw people to the country, since tourism is the major income right now in their economy. So these are the two news stories. And I just want to say, as I said before, Barbados is one of the best run countries on the planet, if not the best, one of the best run. And by the way, their people have one of the longest life expectancies in the world, which tells you if you have that, you're doing something good for the people. So check that out. And by the way, I didn't mention it. One of her achievements was to break away from Britain. And now the head of state is a Barbadian, not the queen. And some of us so brainwashed that, we want to keep the umbilical cord with our oppressor. That was a real statement. And she did it in a classy way. Brought the next King of England in to witness this transfer of power and, did it in the Barbadian way. Nice. You know what I mean? The other thing I want to do before getting into the show is to encourage people to subscribe to the webinar on the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. Each of these shows show you why this is important, and today's show will as well. And I want to encourage people to subscribe to this show by hitting the subscriber button. It's a simple thing, following a few steps. Due to Brother Ogawa, we're now we have another channel on YouTube that presents brief presentations from previous shows and on other platforms, so including Instagram. Now, this show, when I did a report on the number of viewers for the year, is drawing a global audience from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Asia, and from Europe, with the largest viewership coming from Blacks in the United States. But what's interesting is when I do the analytics on each show, what I find that's interesting is in a lot of cases, sometimes as many as half the viewers are non-subscribers. And yet these are shows, and by the way, in a year and 3 months, there's not been one negative comment on any of these shows. I know people like the shows. And a lot of people go back because, the link, they go back and watch part, come back and listen to another part. or whatever they listen to. So this is saying that you need to hit the subscriber button. This is important because this really affects the algorithms. It affects a lot that we can do here. And notice this show is operating on no outside financing. Nobody's screening anything that's being said on this show. And I would encourage people to go out and also encourage others to subscribe. So today's show is connected to last week's show on the real Dr. Martin Luther King. That show had a central focus on power, the power of the Black movement in the South, and particularly the power exerted by Southern Blacks to achieve two big breakthroughs: the Civil Rights Bill coming out of Birmingham and voting rights coming out of Selma, and the accumulated effect of the Black freedom movement in the U.S. with its support in the South, its support throughout the U.S. So these were significant achievements based on Blacks exercising power. And in last week's show, I pointed out that the San Francisco Freedom Movement, which was the only successful freedom movement or Black power movement in the North, that it was another example of the exercise of Black power. And I used it particularly to look at King's approach to organizing in urban communities in the North. And I'm going to stress that while I led this movement, that ain't why I'm stressing it. I'm stressing it because of its achievements, and it was a collective achievement. We had a team of people that made this come about. But the key point is, last week's discussion had a central focus on power and how Black folks can wield it to achieve both gains on a day-to-day basis to improve the lives of our people and long-term to produce liberation. So power was a central theme. So central to the discussion of power in the movements of the 60s was its shift to Black power. And while that wasn't the central point of discussion last week, it was an important part. And so I thought it was logical to continue this discussion, centering this time on Black power. And so today's show, as those of you who have received the promotional can see, today's show is entitled Black Power Part 1, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's independence movement. So this is where we're going for this show. You'll see why I chose this topic, particularly focusing on Garvey and Nkrumah and African independence, in particular, this case, Ghana's independence movement. Next week, the show will be Black Power Part 2, the Black Power movement of the 60s and its meaning for today. So why am I starting with Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's independence movement? I'm certainly not starting here because this was the beginning of Black power. We've been wielding Black power in the world for a very long time. Kemet was the greatest achievement of power for a nation, and just power and creative power in the history of the world. And as I pointed out before, the Twa laid the foundation for that. The founders of Kemet in what's called the pre-dynastic period were Anu people, agrarian Twa. And so while hunter-gatherer societies weren't the big societies that built power, the hunter-gatherer societies provided the vision for just power. And I would suggest when we're looking at this idea of restructuring this society, the most important thing we can draw from are just models. And the African models are, I think, of all, the most important because they are the most just on the planet. Not that all African societies were just. Get that straight. So I'm not focusing on Garvey and Nkrumah and the African independence movement, in this case in Ghana, because this was the first or second move towards Black power in the world. And I'm certainly not going to start a discussion on Black power by going back to Kemet, because we don't need to put it under the category of Black power. Just looking at African history, it covers a whole lot. Because if I did that, then we would be having a series of courses on our history, which will we be doing over time. So the main reason that I'm taking this approach is because the Garvey movement and the African independence movement, particularly in Ghana, which was the first nation to achieve independence south of the Sahara in the 20th century, the Sudan being the first. And the main reason then for taking these two themes is to provide what I consider to be the best window for understanding the connection between national power and global power being wielded by African people. And one of the ways we confuse ourselves on the question of power, and this is one of the things that King raised when he made the point that I quoted last week, that they had not been trained, people in the movement had not been trained, he in particular, was an honest self-criticism to wield power. He was honest about it. So one of the ways you get some training in how to wield power is to understand the connection between your local, state, and national organizing and building of power to the global arena, because anything that's national is proceeding from the local, moving up to the national level. So how do these connect? And it's one of the best classrooms for understanding power. And it will also divest you of the notion that you're completely powerless, because we're going to see how one movement of Africans in the world affects another and affects global change in the world. And so it's a myth to think that you're powerless. And we'll go into that again in a minute. I've been given a lot of examples of that over the last year and 3 months. So this is especially important for the position of Africans in the world at the end of the 20th century throughout the 21st century, these connections that we'll be talking about today. It's only one, there are many others. So when we understand how the Garvey movement ties into African independence movements, we get a deep historical insight into Black power when it's effectively operating on the national stage. It can then trigger things that happen on the international stage. Note I say when it's effective, you know what I mean? And when we look at Garvey, his movement, that was a very effective movement and very powerful. And so this suggests that in understanding power, and in this case, Black power, the globe is a gigantic classroom. And just as I said about the movements for change in this country, you have two teachers. You have your people, and in this case, on the global level, the people of any part of the world you're studying and the forces they're going up against. And so when you see how power is exercised in that arena, then you have a better idea of how you can effectively exercise power where you are. And for me, I'm always looking at strategies, tactics that work in the world. And my books, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, as I pointed out before, had 3 drafts. You could do this on a computer. First one was my experience then of 30 years of organizing. Now it's 62 years. And so that was the first level, my own personal experiences in successful organizing. Second level was our people's experience in this country in successful organizing. And then the third one was the experience of African people, people of color, and any people in the world who are struggling for just change and transformation under the rubric of liberation. And that's important because methods that work in one part of the world can be used to empower you in other parts. And in fact, I've given this example before. I wouldn't be alive and my members wouldn't be alive had I not been in Britain to pick up a book called Low Intensity and Peacekeeping Operations by General Kitson. And he had dismantled movements in Malaysia and the Mau Mau movement in Kenya, and had gone up against the Irish. He didn't beat them, but he went up against them. And then he wrote this book. When I got back to San Francisco State, because I couldn't buy the book in Britain, it wasn't available for sale, I pulled it out of our library as a professor and kept it for 20 years. And then later, my priest told me I had to return it because that was not right, even though I had the right to keep this book as long as I want. I'm a professor. I can do that. So I returned it, but I copied it first. Had I not studied this book, when the FBI ran low intensity operations on my group, they would have taken us out because that is an invisible move. That's their best move. Much better than COINTELPRO that they had run on me. So I was ready for it and kept our people alive as a result. So the globe is a classroom. And don't think that because somebody who's doing something ain't Black, you can't learn from it. As John Henry Clark often taught, African history is world history. You study yourself, but as his master, Arthur Schoenberg, had taught him to study the world first. And that ain't the way I started. But when I apprenticed under John, that's the first thing he did was give me some white people to study. I've been studying for years. Pointed this out before. He told me to read Decline of the West. I told him I had read all of Spengler's books, and then who's the author of Decline of the West. And then he told me to read the 6 volumes by Churchill, which is a lot of propaganda on what he did in World War II. And I read it, you know what I mean? So, but what John was really giving you a message on is African history operates in the context of the world. And if you want to know African history, you need to be studying world history as well. So this exercise into the theme for today, Black Power, Part 1, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's independence movement is important because we're looking at the global connections and how what you're doing in one part of the world affects what you're doing in another part of the world. And you'll see you've been exercising quite a bit of power. And you can exercise more when you're better organized and more conscious of how this power works. One of the key things about looking at how power operates nationally and globally and how they interact and influence each other is to see the role that culture plays in liberation movements. And I've quoted Cabral, who you always see behind me, as making the point that the liberation movement is an act of culture. And so when we're looking at these global power connections, we are particularly looking at how movements for change are cultural expressions, and as they take on entrenched power, oppressive power, in this case, we'll be looking at the Garvey movement and the power structures it took on, which were multiple, including the United States. And when you're looking at how Africans moving for independence were taking on colonial power, and now neo-colonial, which is indirect economic power, then one of the things you're examining is how people change in the course of struggle. King observed when he was looking at the Montgomery bus boycott and other movement activity that the people had changed to what he called the new Negro. And by 1965 to 1966, the new Negro, who was calling himself and herself Black, and then African American and Black. And this transformation is a transformation of self-confidence, a transformation of self-empowerment, because as you take on the power, you begin to see your own power. It transforms you. It doesn't make you arrogant if you want to win. Arrogance will lead you to losing. But it instills a sense of love and respect for yourself and your people that's even greater than whatever you had before. And so in the struggle for liberation, the most important transformation is the transformation of the people themselves, not just the systems they're going up against, and the freedom of the mind and the spirit that leads to the freedom of the body. And that's what the sixfold stages for mental freedom is about. And that's a part of my own experience, but it's the experience of people who engage in struggle. And the deeper they go inside themselves and work on their own internal weaknesses while they're engaging the enemy and attacking them where they're weak, because that's the rule in war, whatever you're doing, hit your enemy in his soft spots. Don't go after his hard spots. That ain't smart. If you're a boxer in the ring and you know that a guy's got a chin, like concrete, go for his stomach. Go for something else. That's the rule in war. You know what I mean? And so the liberation movement's an expression of culture. Now, when King made the honest self-criticism that he hadn't been trained in how to achieve power, and it was a self-criticism that the movement itself needed to take, because we're generally entering the struggle unprepared. Our education hasn't prepared us for these struggles. Whatever our experiences are, we didn't go to school to West Point or something and learn how to do this. We learned it on the fly. And then by and by for other, ways and means, and part of which involved hitting the books. But when King made that observation, it was prefaced by a comment that I didn't comment on last week that applies to this right now. He said that basically, while they were not trained for power, they had been creative. And through improvising, they had come up with a method that was very successful and produced great results. Now, to say that you didn't know how to exercise power, you weren't trained in it, that's being contradicted also by what King's saying, by what led to their achievement, their ability to be creative and improvise and come up with methods that work. And that also indicates King was on to something, that they were fighting for just cause and for victories. And that is the two key requirements in a movement. And when you're talking to anybody who's building power, the question is, what victories have you had? And if all you've had is defeats, you better go back in the corner and check out what you're doing. If you're a boxer and you get knocked out every time you're in the ring, it's time for you to stop boxing, or get a better trainer, or get opponents you can beat. But what's the point of that if you're getting chumps when the goal is to be the best? Maybe you just aren't good at that. You know what I mean? So what I'd say is King underestimated himself there, in part because he was right that he wasn't trained for power. There's a lot of things he didn't know about power, and a lot of us didn't. We were learning. He was right about that. But he underestimated a key feature of the movement's strengths, and it was its culture. And in this particular case, the essence of the African American is creativity. And improvisation and innovation is the way we do it. And they had come up with a new set of jujitsu rules that wrestled a system much stronger than them down and whipped them. You hear me? So what's that got to do with what I'm just talking about? That's a deep expression of your culture. And that's where your power comes from. And so in the case of King's move to the north, he'd have done better if he had had a greater grasp of what he was up against in the north. You know, the urban dynamic, which is also a dynamic for Blacks in the South who have moved into the urban areas, but it's real special up here in the north, real complex. And the San Francisco one we fought in was the second most complex one in the country. I keep driving this one home because y'all don't get it. That was a bad mother for you. You hear me? Bad mother for you. And a lot of my views now come from lessons I learned through the complexities of that movement and then subsequent ones and others that have occurred in the world. So while King was right, we need to study power, learn how it works. As Menu Ampin said, his best classroom was his movement experiences and organizing in the North. That was a classroom for him. Now, the Garvey movement, which is called the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, had its headquarters in New York City. But its largest following was in Jim Crow Southern United States, where to just be Black made life dangerous. Queen Mother Moore was one of the members of the Garvey movement in Louisiana. And she talked about how when Garvey came to Louisiana, to New Orleans to speak, they denied him access to a meeting room. And the UNIA members came out with their guns and forced the sheriff to open up the room for Garvey to speak. You hear me? Malcolm's father came out of Georgia, you know? So the largest following of the UNIA was in the southern part of the United States, where this Black freedom movement came from in the 60s. And interestingly enough, its leader was Marcus Mosiah Garvey, a Jamaican. And it's interesting that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King chose Jamaica for his yearly rest, reflection, and writing, which was smart because his schedule was so jam-packed he didn't have time to breathe. So I know he knew something about Garvey, you know? So the Garvey movement was the largest movement and the largest organization of Black people in the history of the United States. And therefore, why'd I pick it? It's a powerful example of Black power. Garvey never used the term Black power. And by the way, it's a powerful example of Pan-Africanism, which means one Africa. Garvey never used the term Pan-Africanism. In fact, he associated with Du Bois and was often in conflict with Du Bois. He was more consciously an Ethiopianist who drew from the biblical passage, princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hand unto God soon. But he was the best practitioner of the idea of African unity on the ground for his time. and would have a powerful effect on the world. So why Garvey? Bad mother for you. Bad. You hear me? Now, the Garvey movement drew its strength from two influences. One drew from the struggle, the strength of Africans from Jamaica and the Caribbean. But in this particular case, Jamaica, since Garvey came from Jamaica. The other drew from the strength of Africans in the United States. And remember, Garvey couldn't launch his movement in Jamaica. He launched it in the United States. So there's a whole thing there of what made us more receptive under conditions that were extremely difficult. If his base was coming from Ku Klux Klan country, that meant that was a hard choice to side up with Garvey. You're putting your life on the line. You know what I mean? So this point is very important. These two trends, one coming from the culture of Africans in Jamaica, the other, and the Caribbean, but in this particular case, Jamaica, and the other coming from African-American culture. And again, I hope you get the point. For those who still argue, we ain't got no culture, everything I got, culture's up underneath it. You hear me? I hope you get it. I'm presenting evidence for something that we'll go into systematically at some other point. African-American culture. So what did Garvey bring to the table? Garvey brought to the table, first of all, he came out of a maroon background, M-A-R-O-O-N, Maroons. These were enslaved Africans who, when they escaped from the plantation, went into the mountains and formed free African communities. And the Maroon resistance traditions in places like Haiti was really at the base of the inspiration for the only successful slave rebellion in the history of the world. You know, it came out of Maroon resistance heavily. I talked about this before. Mackinac, who tried to poison the whites. And he was the major influence on Toussaint Louverture, contrary to what a lot of historians like C.L.R. James have suggested, that it was mainly the French Revolution. So, and while that was an influence, it was not the primary influence. And so Garvey came out of Maroon background, and the Maroons in Jamaica had successfully carved out some space that they controlled in beating the British. They've not been able to free the whole island as the Haitians were, but they were able to exercise some real power. So Garvey comes out of that. But essentially what Garvey brings to the table is a view of power that comes from people who are a majority in the world. In their country, in Jamaica. And when you're a majority, even though you're under colonialism, you can see the possibility that sometime in the future, you can run that particular space of geography. In this case, Jamaica or another Caribbean island, you know. So Garvey brought to the table, when he was organizing the UNIA and brought it to the United States, he brought this idea of political independence, and in this particular case, independence from colonialism. So this was Garvey's contribution, very important. And Blacks would flock to it because we also had dreams of what Garvey put forward, the independence of Africa. For hundreds of years, many Blacks in this country dreamed of returning to Africa and named their churches after Africa, named their associations, the Free African Society, and many others after Africa. So we were wide open to this. And one reason why Southern blacks were most wide open, of course, most of us were in the South, but still we had some in the North. They were most wide open because they were closest to those roots. And they were also facing terror and could see that Africa could possibly be a place where they could live better than here. So independence from colonialism was the main ingredient that Garvey brought to the political table. From blacks in the United States who had shaped a culture during enslavement that had to be creatively constructed, whereas the culture of Africans in the Caribbean was just dropped straight from Africa into the Caribbean. And then whatever modifications occurred through enslavement, but basically much pure African culture. We had to recreate culture here, drawing from fundamental principles of Africa and injecting some new ones. And this one here is a new one. And this is the primary ingredient that Garvey drew from us. And it was the ingredient of race consciousness. While Black culture is a lot more than race consciousness, it's got a whole lot of ingredients in it. We've talked about some of them before: spirit, a whole democratic and humanistic ethos, a whole bunch of things I'm not going into now. But the key ingredient that really made the UNIA fly was this concept of race consciousness. And it was the glue that helped create a sense of oneness among Blacks in the United States and when taken elsewhere throughout the world. Now, to understand the Garvey movement, it's very important to look at some key research. Most of you ain't going to do this, but some of you have, and others of you may be encouraged to. And there's a lot of different material on Garvey. The most important are the 13 volumes on Garvey provided by Robert Hill, called Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association Papers. 13 volumes. This is the one I showed you as volume 5. If you're going to really understand Garvey, you got to go into the depths of that movement because it was global. It was all over the place. And so the 13 volumes on the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, is the best source book that's out there. And a lot of work that Tony Hill has done on Garvey through this work. This work, these volumes, draw from UNIA newspaper sources, Negro World, one of the best newspapers that Blacks have put together in the United States. Source material comes from intelligence agencies, coming from all over the world, because they were all out after Garvey. Garvey had a constant tail from J. Edgar Hoover, who was then in charge of the Internal Bureau of Investigation. It was not the Federal Bureau of Investigation yet. And when we faced him in the 60s, one of the things that any of us who were conscious should have known is that Hoover had a lot of experience. And so when you're going up against him, you better study your stuff. I come out of Marine Corps background, you know what I mean? I knew I was engaged in war. I studied this stuff. I didn't assume that these guys were nice. You know what I mean? In my brainwashed days, I was into some stuff. I didn't do anything. I was in the Marine Reserves. I wasn't in the war. And by the time I woke up, I was out of it. Cleared me for, not even facing the draft. And I wasn't going to go if I faced it. You know what I mean? But Hoover was on the case of Black folks for a long time. And Garvey was his first big project. You hear me? So, and he was on King's case, on Malcolm's case, and we know what happened there. So if you're going to understand Garvey, you need to read this stuff. Of course, you say 13 volumes. I'm telling you, these volumes are thick here. Most of them over 1,000 pages long. I've read a whole lot of them. You know what I mean? And some of what I'm going to give you as insight comes from that. Others come from other things. And most scholars on Garvey, unless they read all of this, they don't know some of this stuff. In fact, when I was talking to John Henry Clark, he made the comment, he didn't even think Tony Hill knew all of this stuff, because when you're compiling all of this, he may have read everything, but he's got assistants and stuff. And even if he did, are you really digesting it? Because you probably got to take notes. You got to look at it, examine it, think about it. You know what I mean? And when you're dealing with the master, this was a master organizer, then you better look real careful. So I'm preparing you for the fact that what you're getting here is dealing with some stuff that is generally not known, that you are going to gain a knowledge of through doing your homework. Now, Tony Martin is another important source on Garvey. He passed away a few years ago. His most important book on Garvey was Race First, in which he documents how J. Edgar Hoover lined up the district attorney in New York to bring charges against Garvey, and why he did it, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Last time I saw Tony Martin was in Senegal in 2004 African Scholars Conference, where I chaired the plenary on Pan-Africanism in the 21st century, the only African outside of Africa to chair a plenary. And Martin addressed the overall conference, setting the tone, along with Molefi Asante and a French-speaking African who gave the best presentation. So Tony Martin did great work, and it's too bad we lost him, but he did a whole lot of work on Garvey. You want to know Garvey better, read his stuff. And then, of course, John Henry Clark has done some writing as well. So as I discuss Garvey, I also want you to understand this isn't just some scholarly discussion. This is personal. Garvey was my first master. In my house, in my living room, I have two paintings hanging up on the wall. On one side is Garvey, the other one's Malcolm. And Garvey is painted in oil by a Black artist who painted it in 1972. The guy was a bus driver till he lost his job. And so I would give him, painting assignments, pay him, you know what I mean? It's a beautiful painting of Garvey. Garvey's real important for me. It's to Garvey that I owe my skills as an institution builder. This is one of his contributions as an organizer, institution building, especially economic development. Now, I owe those skills partially to my mother, who was good at business, as my brother was. In the movement, very few Pan-African nationalists are good at economics. In fact, they're broke. You know what I mean? And they think that that's a great thing. Now, if that's all you can do because the system is bore down on you, fine. But, people, when they're looking to join a movement, they're also looking to improve their lives. And so economic development is extremely important. And my major study of economics development came through looking at how Garvey did his organizing. That was most important. And then when I underwent my awakening, the sixfold stages of mental freedom, woke up, then I began an indirect apprenticeship under Garvey. What's an indirect apprenticeship? The book I'm writing right now on SEBA is looking at 6 masters, Obinga, John Henry Clark, Ella Baker, Emil Carper-Hall, and others. And a number of them did both direct and indirect apprenticeship. Indirect apprenticeship is where either a person is not around you and you learn from them, or they passed on and you study their work. And most direct apprenticeships where you are in the presence of the person, you also do a lot of indirect apprenticeship, like with musicians. You'll see musicians who will have face time, be in the presence of masters and learn from them, but then also will be listening to their music and stuff at one time on records or CDs or whatever now. So there's direct and indirect apprenticeship. Since Garvey died in 1940, I was born in 1939. Obviously, my apprenticeship was indirect, but it was serious. You hear me? Serious. I read everything I could find on Garvey. And the stuff that I found useful, internalize it, operationalize it, and use it in my organizing work. A couple of times a year, I would travel to New York. This is between 63 and 66 when I chaired San Francisco Core and Congress of Racial Equality. I went there for executive committee meetings. All chapter chairs were on the National Executive Committee and had a say-so in policy. And I would stay at the YMCA in New York and study at the Schoenberg Research Center, Arthur Schoenberg collection. And Schoenberg was John Henry Clark's first master. And so I was then, because of my awakening, engaged in movement action and at the same time study. And when I went to New York, I would go by Michaud's bookstore. Louis Michaud was a major influence on Malcolm X. Malcolm often slept in Michaud's bookstore. They had so many books, they were stacked to the ceiling because they didn't have enough room on the shelves for those books. And I would go and buy books there and talk to Louis Michaud. But the main thing I was concerned about when I went to Harlem in 63 and 64 was finding the 2 volumes on the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. There had been only 300 printed by the UNIA while Garvey was in prison. He wrote these 2 volumes and his wife had them published. And so I would ask Louis Michaud, did he have the books? No. I said, can you search for them? He said, yeah. So I don't remember what year it was, but one of the years I was in there, 63, 64. Remember, my awakening was in 63. And Louis Michaud, I go to the bookstore, he says, yeah, I got the 2 volumes. He showed them to me. He said, just one catch, $100. $100 don't sound like a lot to you, though most of you ain't paying no $100 for a book. But $100 then was at least $1,000 now. I rented a 1,400 square foot Victorian flat in the Fillmore for $200 a month at its highest for 10 years. And when I started at San Francisco State, I was only making $850 a month as a lecturer at the lowest level, full time. Right? So that was a lot of money. And I'm a poor, broke organizer. How'd I get to New York? My father. He paid for the airplane ticket. You know, I'm not ashamed to say it. It's wonderful that he gave me that kind of backing. You know what I mean? And so I told Mr. Michaud, listen, I don't have this money right now. I gave him something to hold the books, you know, lay away. I mean, if you heard Chris Rock and his jokes on how black lay away for this and lay away, I didn't do no layaway. But in this particular case, I did. I remember what I gave him, but the next time I was there, I bought it. And so this right here, and I've shown this once before on the show, this is the book that I bought, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. This is volume 2. and Philosophy Opinions of Marcus Garvey, Volume 1. And I gave this Volume 1 to Julian Richardson to copy, and this became a book that he published so that Blacks could have access to it. So I'm saying this to say that I got about 11,000 books here, the most precious two, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Nobody touches it. It's laid out in a place where the sun can't hit it, and it's got plastic around it to protect the cover. It would be what a Christian called their Bible. You hear me? This is the importance of Garvey for me. Now, I'm going to point out something that most people don't know, most scholars don't know, and this comes from reading Hill's volumes on the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and this is about Garvey. And this is extremely important in understanding why he was successful in what he did. Most scholars know this, and most people that have studied Garvey know this. Garvey had trouble winning a following when he first started organizing Blacks in the United States. He first came here to meet Booker T. Washington. Booker T. had died before he got here. And then he traveled around the United States and made some very important observations, because as an outsider, he could have a better appreciation sometimes than we had of our own strengths. And Garvey did that. His first speech in Harlem, he fell off the stage. You hear me? And he had to reorganize branches, because as he began to build a branch, then party machine Blacks would come in and split it, take part of it. But he was having a big problem in getting his message over and connecting to Black people. Garvey came out of the Maroon tradition, and he had a sense of basic pride in his Blackness. But he came out of an island culture where racism wasn't in your face all the time. And the British have a good way of grinning and skinning. You know, they'll put on this aristocratic accent and do you in. You know what I mean? So no wonder the Jamaicans, including Garvey, were not race conscious. He picked up a little race consciousness when he traveled to Britain, but he wasn't race conscious. And so without this race consciousness, he couldn't tap into the intellectual framework of Black folks in this country. Now, you ain't getting this in no book, you know what I mean? Because they all just tell you Garvey came, woke us up, built a great movement. Nah, it don't work like that. You know what I mean? So another problem Garvey had in communicating with Blacks during the post-World War I period is that Garvey identified, and I pointed this out before, with the King of England, King George. He loved him. He wrote a letter telling him how much he loved him. Garvey. He supported King George and the Western world's, war called World War I. He supported it. In part because Garvey admired power. You know what I mean? He admired power. Later, he'd become more sophisticated, more political, and we contribute to that. But his own learning would contribute to that as well. So he had a second problem. He couldn't get a message to the Black grassroots at the end of World War I who had become anti-war. They had been sent to World War I by their leaders, telling them to fight to make the world safe for democracy. Du Bois was telling them that. The NAACP was telling them that. Then they came back and they were facing bloody summers. These whites had come back from World War I, and Blacks were occupying jobs that they had and living in their neighborhoods that they thought were their own. And so there were bloody summers, and Blacks fought back. So blacks had felt used because when they came back, they weren't safe from a lynch mob. And the last thing they saw was some democracy. They saw some hypocrisy. They saw some bloodshed. And they were prepared to deal with it. You hear me? So you're not going to be able to get to the ear of the masses of blacks unless you understand that. And if you pro-war, the ears are going to be shut. They ain't listening to you. You hear me? So Tony Hill's volumes, one of the volumes, I was reading it, and it tells about Garvey, this end of World War I, and Garvey's frustrated. He's getting ready to go back to Jamaica. He's been unsuccessful in organizing blacks in this country. And he decides to attend a meeting by Hubert Harrison. Hubert Harrison is one of the great intellectuals of the race, comes from the Caribbean. Brilliant writer, brilliant thinker. And Harrison had called a series of meetings dealing with lynching, opposing lynching, and also expressing opposition to this war. And so when Garvey goes to this meeting, the first one is he's sitting and listening, and he's hearing this militant messages coming from the grassroots, as well as from Hubert Harrison and others. And Harrison is talking about the new Negro, which is what King described the awakening of blacks in the South as experiencing the mentality of the new Negro. And so this is what was being defined as this new awakening among blacks at the end of World War I, the new Negro. So Garvey comes back a second time and is allowed to speak. And he begins to get an understanding through Harrison, through his own exposure to blacks who are militant, starting with Harrison's rallies. And so he begins to incorporate into his mindset this idea of race consciousness or race first. And he begins to shift his position on World War I. He becomes anti-war. Now he's in a position where blacks are going to listen. See, this is the thing about leadership. Leading is following. But don't do it for opportunistic reasons. You better believe this stuff because you will be tested. You hear me? So Garvey was really following the people who woke him up. And then as he woke up to the reality of race consciousness and anti-war sentiment, then with his message, tying those two together with African independence, and then the UNIA had a human rights platform that dealt with the opposition to the oppression of blacks in this country, Garvey now had some music that blacks could dance to. Of course, side note, Garvey actually liked opera. He didn't think too much of the blues. Now, Garvey, too bad for you, brother. He thought that blacks would have been better off with operatic music. I don't think so. But the point is, Garvey was now on our page, playing our music and bringing in some of the music of his own. And so what's important here to understand is this. Race consciousness for the African in the Caribbean and the African in Africa did not develop in the Caribbean or in Africa. It developed in the United States and in Europe. Wherever the colonizer was, where Africans went, and they experienced down-home racism. And the place where they experienced it most was the United Snakes of America, especially if you travel through the South, but any part of the country. And so it's important to understand that it's when Africans traveled outside of Africa or the Caribbean into Europe or the United States that they lived among Blacks, they attended their universities, went to their churches, took part in their study groups, dated Black women, as Kwame Nkrumah did. He was so poor that, as John Henry Clark said, he could barely afford to buy him an ice cream, you know. But it was through that interaction and facing racism on a day-to-day basis and engaging in discussions with Black folks that they began to incorporate into their mindset this notion of race consciousness, that we're oppressed on the basis of the color of our skin, but that we need to unify together as a people and fight it and be proud of our Blackness as well. And so what happens then, the understanding of race consciousness enables Africans from the Caribbean and Africa to begin to understand the nature of their oppression. This is the real key thing, because what they see, particularly in the colonies like Ghana that are not settler colonies where millions of whites have come to settle as they did in South Africa, they just see a few representatives of Britain or France or whatever the colony was. So they don't really get a real in-depth understanding of how this oppression works. But when they get inside these countries, they begin to see how racism works. And they see how that's tied into economic oppression. And someone like Kwame Nkrumah came poor. And so he had to work every kind of job. In fact, he nearly destroyed his health doing some of the jobs he did, you know, but it educated him. So this was the nature of both the impact of the Garvey movement. It was driven by race consciousness and this striving for independence coming from Garvey and a Caribbean or culture where Blacks are a majority. But in turn, this experience of race consciousness that Garvey had was a very way in which Africans coming from different parts of Africa or the Caribbean got inculcated with race consciousness as well. And it was a part of what politicized them. And in the case of Africans coming into the United States and Britain, they got exposed to Pan-Africanism, another tenet of African-American culture and African Caribbean culture, because Pan-Africanism, the notion of one Africa, was given birth in the United States and the Caribbean, especially Trinidad, where you have some of the strongest Pan-Africanists coming from. George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Kwame Ture himself, you know. But it isn't just that race consciousness impacted Africans who were coming from Africa or the Caribbean. Race consciousness impacted people of color who were also being colonized. One of the greatest leaders in the 20th century was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was so dedicated to his people that he refused to sleep when he became president of Vietnam, elected by the people. He refused to sleep in the presidential quarters that were luxurious. He slept in the servants' quarters. When he died, you could put all his possessions in a duffel bag. He was a Confucianist. That is, he learned from his father ethics. Confucianism is about ethics. And he was a principled person. And while he was a Marxist, believing in Leninism, he was a nationalist first. And he embraced Leninism because Lenin said that in the colonial situation, all the different factions need to form a united front and fight the colonizer. Ho Chi Minh didn't learn this from Lenin. That was his position. That's not a Marxist position. That's a nationalist position. And so he embraced Marxism via the Soviet Union because he said, I need one group of whites to help me fight the other. And he needed their weapons. But he already knew about this need for unity. And so Ho Chi Minh was working on a steamship line, working for the French. And he stops in New York and attends a meeting of the Honorable Marcus Garvey. And what does he hear? Africa for the Africans, one of Garvey's slogans. Asia for the Asians. Europe for the Europeans. And he said, I remember reading this in People's World, which is a communist newspaper. Good thing to read. I know y'all told the commies are no good. Read anything that's got a critique on what's going on in the world that's independent. And Ho Chi Minh said, I asked myself, what am I doing? Working for the French on their steamship lines. I need to go back to Vietnam and run these Frenchmen out of Vietnam. He said Garvey was his influence. And so when Kwame Ture visits North Vietnam and sees Uncle Ho, gets and bows down and shows his respect, Uncle Ho tells him this story. And then he told him, you need to get your black behind to Africa and help Africa in its liberation. So, and it was this race consciousness that propelled him on this. And in Ho Chi Minh, spent enough time in the U.S. to understand the Klan. In fact, I was working out at the Y, and it's an older brother who had been in the Marines in Vietnam, was a major, which is a pretty high rank for a young black person in the Marines, because the Marines are the most racist of all the military services. And he had had an uncle who was in Africa, and he met Ho Chi Minh. And in Africa, they were watching Frenchmen shoot Africans who were swimming in the lake. And Ho Chi Minh said that's what they do, because they would do the same thing in Vietnam. They would ride these steamboats and with rifles just shoot at people like they were dogs, like they did us in Mississippi or are doing to us now with the police and everybody else. And so Ho Chi Minh acquired some race consciousness through that exposure to the black experience. And so when black soldiers went to Vietnam, they got educated by Uncle Ho. And I talked to a Marine Corps captain, brother, intelligence officer, not very smart if you're an intelligence officer in the Marine Corps. Yeah. And so blaring from the loudspeaker coming from Ho Chi Minh's people is this message. American Negro, because that's the term we use then. What are you doing here? Fighting your brown brothers and sisters. The color of their skin is the same as yours. And when you go back to the United States, the racism you face there, you're not going to be able to buy a house in a white neighborhood. Now, the average Vietnamese ain't going to know this, but someone who had traveled throughout the United States, as Ho Chi Minh did, understood it firsthand. He acquired some race consciousness. You hear me? Provided some fuel to the fire. And in fact, when blacks hit the field in Vietnam, the Vietnamese had a standing order coming from Uncle Ho, don't shoot the blacks. But that's provided that the blacks don't shoot back. And it got so bad that on some of these patrols, blacks weren't being shot at. So Westmoreland, who was one of these dumb 4-star West Point graduates who got his butt kicked in Vietnam, that's why I say he's dumb, had any sense, he'd pull out. You can't win no guerrilla war. And so Westmoreland started having all his soldiers blacken their faces so they could get a black pass. It didn't work. You know what I mean? So race consciousness didn't just propel consciousness in the African world, Caribbean or Africa, but in the world of color as well. And Garvey played a big part in that. So when you're talking about power, and we ain't got any, ain't that some power? You know, as sister said, ain't I a woman? Ain't that some power? I think so. So the black grassroots woke Garvey up, and he started thinking black, shifted his stance on analysis to a race-first analysis, and from pro-war to anti-war. And so Garvey's movement kicked off. And the main thing that a lot of people miss on Garvey's movement kicking off is the key incentive was an anti-war thing. And so when the Versailles Peace Conference takes place, the end of World War I, Garvey tried to send a delegation to that conference. Du Bois was also there. And the only one that could get through, because they were either denied passports or couldn't get into France, the one that got through was from Haiti. He was a member of the UNIA and he had a French passport. So he got in. And Garvey's whole point, and this is again how his movement caught hold, was to demand the partition of the German colonies and turn them over to Africans, including Africans in the diaspora. Africa for the Africans. Now, this wasn't about to happen. But what happened is, because Garvey was such a good propagandist with his Negro World, with one of the largest circulations of any paper and the largest of any black paper in the United States, Garvey was propagandizing Africans everywhere. And he was beginning to draw them to his banner, the red, black, and green, the UNIA colors of their flag. Because Garvey was operating like a nation within a nation. And so within this nation within a nation, Garvey was the provisional president of Africa. And then you had a president of the United States, of blacks in the United States, a man named Eason, who led the Philadelphia branch of the UNIA, which Malcolm's father and mother were members of. And according to John Henry Clark, Eason was a better speaker than Garvey, more imposing, tall, and everything else. But he spoke to the needs of blacks in this country. They're operating like a nation. They had a paramilitary group, which the Fruit of Islam was patterned after. And by the way, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a corporal in the Garvey movement. He never denied it. When people had asked him, he never said no, and people in the movement said he was. And part of the Nation Islam was patterned after the organization of the UNIA, especially their business organization and their blackness, not their Africanness, but their blackness. The Garvey UNIA movement had a black nurses corps. That would imply you'd need nurses for something, huh? What could that be? He had a black church, the African Orthodox Church, led by Bishop McGuire, and some of the most advanced Afrocentric thinking came out of that church, even more advanced than Garvey's. You hear me? Because, you know, you can't have a movement of black folks unless you got a spiritual component to it. The key thing about the Garvey movement is the UNIA was the first organization in the United States to organize a mass struggle for African independence from colonial rule. That was the main thing, because bringing in this vision of Africans ruling themselves, coming from a place where Africans were a majority and were colonized, then Garvey could understand the anti-colonial struggle. And by the way, one of the people that Garvey studied were the Irish. And as racist as the Irish have been towards us, still, they were the British first colonial project. They sent the Scots-Irish into Ulster, told them, which was Irish land, told them they could have it if they chopped the Irish heads off or scalped them. You hear me? And so the British experimented on colonialism with white people, in this case, the Irish. And so Garvey, and traveling to London and doing some study there, he observed the Irish and how their movement worked and learned some lessons from them, something that a good organizer does. Another thing that Garvey was doing was, and this is again global power, an example of global Black power, Garvey sought to create an international Black power alliance after World War II, a Black nationalist, a Pan-Africanist globally. This was like the Black International. And Stalin and them, they tried to counter this by coming up with a position called the Black Belt South to counter Garvey's Africa appeal, that Blacks should get a nation in the South. That was their attempt to counter it. But Garvey had a big impact on Africa that's not generally understood at a time when Africa was under lockdown. So the South African Department of Native Affairs reported in 1921, this is colonial department, that there were UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association branches in Cape Peninsula, in Claremont, in Cape Town. In July 1923, 5 new South African UNI divisions were launched, along with divisions in a place in South Africa called West London and in Pretoria. The Pretoria branch had 100 members. And you had Africans in other parts of the world identifying with this movement. The king of Swaziland said this: he had only heard of 2 great Black people in the whole wide world, Jack Johnson, who was knocking out white people at a steady clip, and that was a bad brother. Bad is good. And Muhammad Ali patterned himself a lot after Jack Johnson, though his style was Sugar Ray Robinson, the best boxer in history, period. He had the best record. And he said the other person, the other great Black person he heard of in the world was the Honorable Marcus Garvey. By the way, note that Elijah Muhammad's title was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Think that's a coincidence? Huh. What's commonly also not known is Garvey had a Black Star shipping line. That's known. But what's generally not known is he was petitioned by African farmers in different parts of Africa to use that line so that they could ship their agricultural goods through his steamship line. Because if we didn't have our own steamship line, then the white steamship lines were buying African agricultural goods for practically nothing and ripping these farmers off. And they simply wanted to have a good, cheap passage, a reasonable passage, so they take their goods to these different parts of the world and sell them themselves. So Garvey's ventures that had a lot of small shops and everything else was identified with in Africa. And by the way, when Nkrumah becomes independent, he calls his navy the Black Star Lines, his ships the Black Star Lines. You hear me? We'll see why in a minute. So what does this have to do with Kwame Nkrumah and what was then called the Gold Coast? It was called the Gold Coast before it was renamed Ghana. What does this have to do with the movement for political independence in Africa? See, again, when you understand how power works globally, you'll understand that if you're wielding power in one part of the world, chances are it's going to influence how you wield power in another part of the world. In this case, we're talking about African people. So Nkrumah was one of those Africans who come out of Africa, and in this case comes to the United States Lincoln University to acquire an education, a Black university. While in the United States, he's one of those Africans who takes part in study groups, one of which was Wallace Huggins' study group that John Henry Clark participated in. And John talked about, Nkrumah talked about, he had teeth that were so white and so straight, they didn't look real. They were so pretty. And that he was a jokester. And when he engaged you in a debate and won, he'd tap you on the shoulder and then say, "I got you. Ha ha." Kwame Nkrumah. He's studying under Wallace Huggins and other Black scholars some in-depth stuff on African history while he's gone to Black University. Nkrumah is being educated in the streets of Harlem, and particularly the corner street orators. And he was a preacher. You know, he majored in religion and economics. So he preached in Black churches. And you say, oh, yeah, well, one thing about that is you're in close contact with the people. And you also get to sharpen your oratorical skills, because Blacks in the United States got some of the best oratorical skills in the world. You want to really polish your stuff, get in a Black church and see if you can move an audience. Good luck. You know what I mean? So Nkrumah was being instilled with Black culture as he brought in Ghanaian culture into this country. And his mind was being reshaped along race consciousness and the political vision of Africa, Pan-Africanism, to such an extent that he called his version, the United States of Africa. I pointed this out before. When he's later in exile in Guinea, his publisher was saying, doesn't that sound a whole lot like the United States? Don't you think you need to take the United States out of that? He said, once we unify Africa, we can change that. I think, no, you need to change that before. But the point is, the idea of Pan-Africanism came from Black folks. That's one of our political bags. And he does his advanced study under George Padmore, real name Malcolm Nurse, who was the highest ranking Black in the government of the Soviet Union before he broke with them. He was a colonel in the Soviet Union, had been a Marxist until he decided that he wasn't going to pursue Stalinist efforts in Africa to align with the colonial powers, because now they're fighting the Germans when those colonial powers are oppressing Africa. So he broke with them. But Nkrumah again goes to Britain and gets to apprentice under master organizer George Padmore. And as I pointed out before, was an assistant of Padmore's in organizing the 5th Pan-African Congress, the most important meeting of Africans in the 20th century, where Africans got together and didn't just pontificate, they charted the course for African independence, and Nkrumah would be the first one to leave Europe and go back and lead a successful African independence movement. I always put successful. Hey, you get no damn struggle and get whipped. Successful, you hear me? And this is what I'm going into now. So Nkrumah gained in his sojourn here race consciousness, a sense of African unity and its importance. And he said this: of all the books he has read, the books that inspired him most were, guess what? The philosophy and opinions of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And by the way, hello to you Jamaicans. Y'all is bad. an island that is large in the scope of, at least comparing it to some Caribbean islands, but small compared to the world powers, y'all play way out of your size. Whether it's in sports, whether it's in politics, whether it's in the arts, with the bad Bob Marley and the Rastafari. Give credit where credit is due. You hear me? So you see the connection now between Garvey and Nkrumah, between blacks and Garvey. This is all about power, baby, but it's also about love, because Nkrumah developed a great deal of love for blacks in this country, as he did for his own, already had for his own people, and we towards him, and Garvey as well, both ways. You know what I mean? One people, even though we come from slightly different environments. You know? So what we see then is African American culture and African Caribbean culture was a big inspiration for Kwame Nkrumah. And the fact that Garvey was a leader who called for immediate independence. The Pan-African movement under Du Bois was one that was talking about reform, which means that they were getting ready to run a country. They didn't think the people were ready yet. But Garvey was calling for immediate right now. And so when they have the Fifth Pan-African Congress, the ghost of Garvey is all over the place. His first wife is attending. Garvey is dead by then. He dies in 1940. Fifth Pan-African Congress is in 1945. As I pointed out before, I met my wife speaking at the anniversary of the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, where this Congress was held. You know, so that's a little reward for pursuing the Pan-African path. You know what I mean? So Nkrumah gets a lot from his sojourn in the United States. 2 years after the Fifth Pan-African Congress is organized, leaders from the Gold Coast, August of 1947, in a place called Salt Pond, S-A-L-T-P-O-N-D, they meet and they form an organization called the United Gold Coast Convention. Its goal is self-government for Ghana, then called the Gold Coast. Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah, was asked by this group to return to Ghana and to become its full-time, the United Gold Coast Convention, its full-time organizer, which they called its full-time secretary. Now, it's interesting that they didn't call this the United Gold Coast Convention Party. They just called it the United Gold Coast Convention. You'll see why that distinction is important. Now, according to the assistant to Kwame Nkrumah, a man named Kofi Bako, B-A-A-K-O, he's given Nkrumah's official story that what happens when he returns to Ghana. Nkrumah, of course, agrees to come back. This is like God sent for him. He's going to get paid to organize an independence movement. Uh-oh. The thing is, the people who hired him, they didn't understand a few things. This was Kwame Nkrumah, who came from one of these little tribes that only produced, as John Henry Clark said, teachers. And they assumed that someone coming from a tribe like this would not have any aspirations to lead a country. They were bringing him there to organize an independence movement that they would lead. And I'll explain the they in a minute. But what they don't understand is this Kwame Nkrumah is not this young man who had gone to missionary school and, was a proper Ghanaian. He was a proper Ghanaian, but much more than that. He was a race-conscious, politicized Pan-Africanist. And so when he comes back, he declares that the United Gold Coast Convention was, quote, this is coming from his representative, the People's Nationalist Movement. Uh-oh. Race consciousness was at the key of this. And of course, this also meant Pan-Africanism for Nkrumah. Now, this was something that the people who hired him didn't like. This was not their idea. They were not bringing him back to organize an African nationalist movement, let alone what would become clear later, a Pan-Africanist one that wants to unify Africa. You know what I mean? So when we're examining power, and in this case, Black power, it's important to know that while race comes first for Black people, you can never rule out class. That is the way in which your education, your skill set translates to a position in the social structure. And some end up being people who labor and work, and they're in one class. And you got people who get educated and can translate this into professional positions. And they may become middle class. And then you have some who get into the highfalutin area, and they become a part of the Black elite. In this country, the Black establishment of the Black power structure, which you need to know. Because one of my first lessons in the movement was that there's class and then there's ass. You know what I mean? Some people with the class act like what I just said, but that it ain't just race, it's also interest. People have different interests based on these class positions. And then I was meeting with Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, the president of Tanzania, and we both talked about how caste interacts with race and class. And so what you have is a caste system in the United States where I don't care what class you are in, if you're Black, whites get the right to take your life and usually suffer no consequences. That's caste. Nyerere made the point that white people could come to Tanzania with literally no skills but their whiteness and secure a job. Not if he had anything to say about it, but some in his government did because they thought white was right. You know what I mean? The colonial mentality. So the Gold Coast Convention was made up of the professional class of lawyers and doctors with degrees from Britain. The leader of this group that I'll mention in a minute had a law degree from Oxford. That's the elite university in the United Kingdom. Now, generally, Oxford degrees and Harvard degrees create Oxford and Harvard mentalities, not always, but often. Remember, I made the statement before that one of our leading scholars who wrote Miseducation of the Negro, Carter G. Woodson, said it took him years to undo the miseducation of Harvard. And many of our people who come out never do, you know? So that was the group that brought Nkrumah. And remember, Nkrumah had been barely existing in the United States for 10 years. So elite, he read about it, but he certainly hadn't experienced that. So this elite group of Africans objected to the idea that they were representing the aims of the people. They did not see themselves as being in that position. They saw their organization as one that would tell the people what to do. rather than represent their interests. Their leader was a brilliant man named Danquah, Danquah, who's author of a great book called The Akan Conception of God, which is a very good exploration of Akan philosophy and spirituality. It's a very good book, and people should read it. He was also a Christian, but he had an appreciation of African culture. And him and Nkrumah both agreed that they wanted self-government, but they had different ideas of how this would work. Now, Richard Wright, who was author of this book, Black Power, who was also a great novelist, written a number of important books, including Native Son and Black Boy, from Mississippi, had been for a number of years a Marxist, but was no longer one when he was in Ghana. Richard Wright, in this book, describes a meeting that he had with Danquah. And this is during the time in which Nkrumah and his movement is negotiating independence from the British, negotiating and organizing and putting pressure on the British. And so Richard Wright comes and asks Danquah some questions because he had attended a meeting where Nkrumah presented his case to the British for independence, and Danquah responded, objecting to Nkrumah's party, Convention People's Party. And Richard Wright wasn't very impressed with his response. He basically, his objection to what Nkrumah said was that Nkrumah was going to make Ghana a Malta, which is a little small island in the Mediterranean. That was all he could really say. So when Richard Wright meets Danquah, he raises the question of why didn't Danquah organize to represent the interests of the Gold Coast masses. And this really shows the attitude of this elite group, but especially Danquah towards the people. And it shows also the difference that Nkrumah would have with Danquah, who had hired him to lead this movement for self-government. So Danquah's response to the question of why don't you organize to represent the interests of the masses of Ghanaians is he said, quote, "I don't like this thing of the masses. There are only individuals for me." He's really missed a whole lot here, because without the masses, there's no independence. Of course, he thought there was, because the Gold Coast Convention, this movement, their point was to succeed as the head of independent Ghana, and they thought the British would pass the baton to them. And had there not been an active movement, they were probably right. And so Nkrumah, in many ways, doing the organizing he would do, coming from the consciousness that he had acquired, would upset the apple cart for Danquah. And so after saying that he didn't like this thing of the masses, which is your route to power, without the masses pushing for the independence of Ghana, then the British can play around or pick some puppets, So Danquah went on to say that he couldn't organize the masses. He called this emotion. In other words, he saw the masses as emotional. This is Platonic thinking, because this is the way Plato thought. The intellectuals reason, the masses feel, they don't think, which is as far from the truth as you can get. Still, Danquah's strength was he had a deep appreciation of a Khan culture. It's just that it had been corrupted by elitism coming out of his British miseducation. So the reason I'm going into these different views on organizing for self-government is to show that in building Black power, Black people will have different interests at different times, certain groups of Black people. And in building power, you must take into account these different interests and where you can reconcile them. Usually in the independence movement, different interests can be reconciled because there's a common goal, which is to throw out the colonizer. And so you'll have elites, you'll have religious groups in Vietnam, you had Buddhists, and you had some Catholics. In Africa, you have these different groupings. And usually you can get a common denominator, which is throw out the colonizer. Now, once that happens, then problems emerge. But it goes slightly different in Ghana for reasons that I'm going to explain. But it's key to understand these different interests that are guiding people in different ways. For example, when you're looking at King was under great pressure from the government because he was the big one. He was the maximum spokesperson for the Black freedom movement. And so he came under pressure that Kwame Nkrumah wouldn't face, though he faced a lot of pressure, not the kind that King faced, because King had a relationship with Johnson, for example. The real measure of King is that while he made some compromises, small ones, like he wasn't at the Raymond Pettus Bridge when the attack occurred on marchers, Selma to Montgomery March. He was observing an injunction put on by federal courts. And he would do some other things. But on essentials, King didn't compromise. He stood on the side of the best interests of the masses of Blacks, though he was a PhD, though he came from this elite group coming out of the South. You know what I mean? A family of preachers. When it came to the key issues, he sided with the poor. He sided with the oppressed, and that was the measure of the man. And this is the challenge Nkrumah faced. Which side did he stand on? Because he was being paid by a group of elitists, and therefore, under certain circumstances, he could take positions that supported them and be favored, though not in power. He could probably have a ministerial position, maybe, under Dankwa, maybe. So what happens is the interests, and this is a part of studying power, how interests collide and conflict, and then what do you do when they do? A conflict emerges in Ghana, February 28, 1948. Other leaders have negotiated with the British on a demand that they lower the price of foreign goods. The foreign goods are too high. Ghanaians are, paying too high a price. The British promised to lower the price and, as usual, speak with a forked tongue. The people erupt spontaneously. The market sisters, the, everyday people, Black soldiers who had fought for the British in Burma and in India. And they stage a march. And in this march, 3 African soldiers who had fought for the British are murdered. And this creates mass hysteria in Ghana. And the party that Nkrumah is representing then, headed by Dankwa and others, forced the British to set up a constitutional convention. And when this constitutional convention is set up, the British play another game. And it's one that Dankwa wouldn't have trouble with. And it is that the committee that's set up, made up of Ghanaians, is made up of upper class people. chiefs, and lawyers. And the chiefs in Africa, too often, these were kings, had become mouthpieces for the colonizer. Some had not, but many had. One of Danqua's strengths is he understood the positives of chieftaincy. It was really kingship. The white boys called them chiefs. They were kings. And they were responsible to the will of the people. But under colonialism, they become responsible to those in power, the British. And so it's from these two groups that the British picked the people who are going to set up this constitution. The upper class of chiefs and lawyers. Excluded from this group are the youth, are the market women, who are the backbone of the economy of Ghana, both the cocoa economy and the general trade that is done on a day-to-day basis. It's the women who are largely carrying this out. To exclude them is to exclude the real economic power in Ghana. And without them, Nkrumah would have never become prime minister of Ghana. Get that straight. You hear me? So this is a big mistake on the part of the British, because what happens is the people go wild. I want you to get this again. The people, see, this ain't Nkrumah leading all of this. The people go wild. The market women who traded on the streets and the nationalist organizations that Danqua's group didn't want to have anything to do with, they launched demonstrations. They demand that they be put on this commission. What Nkrumah does with his training and organizing, he then pulls together Ghanaian youth and forms Ghanaian youth committees. And they put forward 3 demands. And those 3 demands are, and these are very important because he sharpened his organizing skills in his sojourn in the United States and Britain. So he sees how to formulate demands that bring in the whole people, satisfy different groups, bring in the market women, bring in the nationalist groups, bring in the youth, bring in other groups. And so 3 demands get put forward by Ghanaian youth committees across Ghana. 1, they want universal adult suffrage, the very demand that King and them made, the Southern movement made and got, in this case through federal legislation now being eroded here. So that's the first thing. That means that you're empowering the people with the vote to make the basic decisions on independence and on governance. This is a different kind of democracy than Ghana had under traditional systems, where the king had a council and it was the consensus of the council. In villages, everybody had a say-so because consensus is the basis for African democracy. But here, universal adult suffrage, this is a innovation coming from how the West operates, but being taken very seriously here to empower the people to run their own country. Do the ballot, male and female. The second demand they put forward is a fully elected legislature with a fully representative cabinet. That means different groupings get put on this cabinet that make very important recommendations to the head of government and to parliament. And then the third demand was collective ministerial responsibilities. This means that the ministers of different affairs, education, housing, defense, whatever it is, they're responsible to their party and to their people. So these are demands that unify Ghanaians, whereas what the British did divided them. And these demands are the basis for Ghana establishing independence. Now, I want to conclude this on a very important point that's often neglected, even though I've talked about it, but usually not in this context. and it is the connection between culture and power. Now, we've seen it already in terms of race consciousness, the idea of independence, but this is at a more fundamental level in which African culture, in this case in Ghana, drove this African independence movement. In this book, Black Power, Richard Wright discusses a very important event that was the most important that he experienced in his travels in Ghana. You know, I read this book 30 years ago. By the way, when I bought it, the book was selling for $4. So you can tell how long ago that was. I bought this book in the late 60s or early 70s. So I went back and reread it. And Richard Wright is advised by George Padmore's wife to go to Ghana. Padmore, the organizer of the Fifth Pan-African Congress, who would become a chief advisor to Nkrumah once Ghana becomes independent. And he asked Padmore's wife, why should I go? And she said, you need to go because they're getting ready to set up an independent state in Ghana. You need to be there to see what's happening and report on it. Give us the information on it. So he was persuaded to go. Instead of flying, he took a ship so he could have time to think about what he wanted to cover when he was in Ghana. And in this book, in the front of it is a letter from Kwame Nkrumah certifying to the good character of Richard Wright, because he knew Richard Wright in the States. He knew most of the blacks who were politically active in the United States and would bring them into his government, that is, working on some level. Maya Angelou was working in Ghana, you know, a host of others. Julius Mayfield, a host of others. So when he sees Nkrumah after arriving in Ghana, Nkrumah takes him on a drive through the poorest sections of Ghana and the nicest section. He said, I want you to see the best. I want you to see the worst. And this is what I'm going to conclude on, because this is very important. Everywhere they drove, when the people saw Nkrumah's car, they would start jumping up and hollering, singing one thing: freedom, freedom, freedom. And Kwame Nkrumah would wave back. He'd wave back. You could see that Nkrumah was a symbol for them of their independence, of their freedom. But this was what was important. As Wright was in the automobile with Nkrumah, the most memorable impression of his entire stay in Ghana occurred when he started watching the people who were saying freedom. They were mostly market women shouting freedom. But then he noticed they shouted it doing a shuffling dance with their arms, legs, and necks all weaved together the way African people do. Now, Richard Wright was of the school of E. Franklin Fraser that argued that blacks in the United States had lost their culture through slavery. Somehow we got off the slave ships and suddenly became Americans, right? So he thought that that was true. He thought that the racial ideal was the only thing that they had in common. You know, they black, you know what I mean? But then when he watched this dance, his head starts to turn around. And he tries to remember, why is this dance impressing him? And this is what he said, quote, I'd seen these same snake-like dances before. Where? Oh, God, yes. In America, in storefront churches, in holy roller tabernacles, in God's temples, in unpainted wooden prayer meeting houses, on the plantations of the Deep South, and I would add in the storefront churches in just about every Black community in the United States of America. Now, what he's observing here is what Dr. Joseph ben Yochanan observed in his best work, African Origins of the Major Western Religions. This was his best work. And he made the same observation in more detail, talking about how in the sanctified church, there's a ritual where you don't cross your legs, because if you do, you're going to mess up the spirit possession. It was the same stuff you do in voodoo or Santeria. Because what he was watching in Africa was manifested in the Black church, particularly those that are supported by the grassroots, especially the storefront ones that are most African, found in the Pentecostal and other churches. But it is a part of what Blacks dropped into what they call the Black church after slavery, which was basically voodoo. And so it led him to realize that there's much more among African Americans as African than he thought. And this was his mind-blowing experience, because the liberation movement is an active culture. And I'm concluding on this, no Garvey movement, no independence movement in Ghana or Africa or anywhere else, unless the spirit of Africa is infused into the politics. The slogan for Garvey was one God, one aim, one destiny. The people of Ghana saw this movement as a movement of divine providence. They saw Nkrumah as somebody who was speaking for them. And therefore, this was a sacred thing that they were engaged in. It was a political thing. It was removing the oppressors from the face of their land, even though they would have other things to face. So, Black power and African independence. Black power and the Garvey movement. Black power and the freedom movements of the 60s. There's both a political and a spiritual component, a race conscious and a global component that we call Pan-Africanism. And when you wield it, it spins around the world. And you'd be surprised who you're picking up, who you're inspiring, whose eyes you're opening up as you're opening your own eyes up. So that's it. Hotep. So we got some questions here. Brother Ogawa, can you speak more on how Black Americans were engaged in African continental struggles and the building of African post-colonial states that is not talked about much today? A whole lot of things. In the case of the Garvey movement, there was a great concern about Ethiopia. And when Ethiopia is invaded by Mussolini, because it's really the only African nation not to be colonized, African in this country and in other parts of the world are volunteering to fight on the side of Ethiopia. So that's one. And that's Ethiopianism is the inspiration, which I covered in a show on Pan-Africanism dealing with Ethiopianism. The Constitution of Kenya was drafted by Kenyans with the help of Africans from the United States, in this case from the NAACP. So that was a part. Garvey members were part of the UNIA, a part of the ANC, the African National Congress. They had Blacks from the UNIA, a part of that. During the period of the 70s, when you had armed struggles in Africa, in the Portuguese colonies, and also in South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, you had organized work in this country around providing support, material support to these liberation movements. And I led that in the Bay Area, along with Pan-African People's Organization, Pan-African Secretariat, where we gathered 25 to 30,000 Black people a year for a good 6 or 7 years and sent money and supplies to these liberation movements. And a few of our people, not in my group, but in others, actually went into the areas where armed struggle was occurring. One was a brother named Owusu Sadakwe, who went into the armed struggle in Angola. So that was another. As you saw in the discussion on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, carried out by Manu Ampin, he talked about how thick King's folders were on Africa. It was a constant exchange that he had going on with African leaders, and how he attended the independence ceremonies of Ghana and Nigeria, Azikiwe, who helped Nkrumah get admitted to Lincoln University, where he also attended. Azikiwe, one of Nigeria's great leaders. Nkrumah had Africans, as I pointed out in this presentation, from the US working in Ghana. And he had this statement. He said, no part of Africa will be free until all of Africa is free. And so he was supportive of that. There was a lot of other work. So there's been a lot of work done on Africa. Let's see what else we have here. King Pianki, question. I was told that Mr. Garvey studied Queen Nanny of the Jamaican Maroons and that she had a big influence on his organizing and mobilizing strategies. Is that accurate? I would say, yeah, and I'd say specifically the Maroons, period. And his family was also influenced by the Maroons. And he was also influenced in a business way, because he helped manage the business accounts of his uncle, who was a businessman and a farmer, grew ground provisions, which are the food you live on. Lao Tzu. Dr. Tshaka, how do we find the music that we are collectively listening to recreate a movement similar to Garvey's? By music, I know what you mean, the thoughts, the strategy, the organization. We don't need a movement similar to Garvey's, because Garvey's was an independence movement. So now we're past independence, and Africans are facing neocolonialism, which is indirect economic rule, and Africans in the Caribbean as well. And one of the ways you break that is with unity. There are a lot of other ways. We're also imprisoned, as I pointed out before, by the European nation state, something that Garvey didn't question. And by the way, Garvey in London did a lot of reading, and his father had a huge library, and that's where he educated himself. But Edward Wilmot Blyden, he actually checked out of the main British library in the United Kingdom, the book Africa, Life and Customs by Edward Wilmot Blyden, which was the best prescription for how Africans, when they become independent, should organize. And it's one that Africa is not following now. So we have to have a different playbook for this time. This is a different period. And while there are Africans who want to leave and go back to Africa, and they have a right to, The majority of our people are not. And we have to have power, build power here as well as power there. And we have to Africanize this reality and restructuring this place, in my opinion. Lao Tzu. Dr. Chishaku, should we re-examine the life of Dr. King as an example of sixfold transformation to mental freedom through the civil rights movement? Yeah, in this sense that King comes from the standpoint of Black identity. So he didn't go through what Malcolm or I or Amilcar Cabral went through, assimilation. He was deeply embedded in African American culture, heavily influenced by the Black church. So his departure, in terms of connecting with Africa and stuff like that, his African orientation comes through the lens of Black culture, and then his embracing revolutionary consciousness does as well. So I think that he's good for looking at the depth of Black culture. He's good at looking at the internationalization work in terms of working with Africa and how that affected his own politics here. And he's good at looking at where his models for restructuring the country comes from. And I would suggest that from my reading, I don't think much came from Africa. I think he was looking at the models that come out of places like Sweden and other places that were using really a Franklin Delano Roosevelt model of socialism to provide, while it was a capitalist economy, and I think King wanted to eliminate capitalism. He also saw the positives in a society and an economy that looked out for the well-being of people on the bottom and everyone else. So I think that what we need to be looking at more is what we draw out of the African model. And while King was a manifestation of African American culture, and he was conscious of part of it, I think there were parts of it that he wasn't probably as conscious of, because his education, you didn't get that kind of stuff where you were looking at the elements of African American culture and such, but he lived it and he knew a lot of it. Oh, Steve McKenzie, he found a free download on the book Low Intensity and Peacekeeping, no cost. Oh, okay. Lao Tzu said he picked up the same book last week. Okay, let's see what else is here. Lao Tzu. Just a side note on the news from Barbados. Will they lead the Caribbean nation in transforming the University of the West Indies to an African-centered one? Oh, that's a good question. I can't answer that. But I think what I can say is that what my wife has informed me of is that they've made education for Barbadians, and I guess to other people there, at the University of the West Indies free. I think that's pretty good. We need some free, I don't want to joke, but miseducation here. Okay. Got anything else here? Is there anything else? Okay. Brother Mad Minjo. Is there a power center here in the U.S. for unification? Good question. Real good question. Here's the key point about that one. The first power center that any people have is within themselves. So let's start with that one. Because you are your own power, and the rule for your power is as you think, so you are. So, to the extent that you're in mastery of your own mind and spirit, you play a big role in mastering your reality. And so that's part of it. It starts there because wherever power centers are, it's going to be among people who have a sense of power, of empowerment, of being powerful, and of the need for our people to empower themselves. Now, here's the point. When King said we're powerless, I get his point in that that's the will of the rulers of this country. In fact, they only want you to exercise your activities in areas they approve, like entertainment. And don't get out of line. Just make us laugh. You know what I mean? Or sports or something like that. But then they don't particularly like our brother King James, who is doing some stuff for his people, or Steph Curry or others who are doing some stuff in the community. They ain't particularly interested in that. You know what I mean? But generally, there's sanctioned, approved areas where you can exercise your power that will make them laugh and not be a threat to them. But when you're free inside of here, you exercise your power on all domains. So here's the key point I'm going to make about this point that you're making here. I made this point before, and history proves it. I've lived it. Some of you are living it. It's happening under your nose right now. The Black movements for freedom are the leading movements for freedom in this country. And when they go into motion, create a chain reaction throughout the world. You just saw this last one with Black Lives Matter and throwing Trump out of office. That was a power center that came from people who were angry over the murder of Black men and women by the police, rose up to do something about it. It spread to 50 states and 50 countries around the world. But the key point is, Blacks led that. And why they led that? Because your culture, your consciousness, and your capacity to organize is like the leading force for change in this country. The 60s proved that. Garvey proved it as the Lone Ranger, because at his time, Blacks didn't have that, kind of ability to do what we can do now, particularly outside this country and even in this country. And in spite of the limitations of this country, he did it, So the culture is really the hidden secret thing in this. And so your power center is where your people are, where their culture resides inside of them, and where they make their plans, their organizing, their strategies, and their tactics to produce change in their communities. So you're in a real difficult position now. We are. Broken communities, drugs, violence. As bad as the police violence is, we're killing more of each other than anybody else. When I say we, a small number of shooters in each community. It's not all Black youth going out and doing this, and their lives are the ones that are most in danger. So these are difficult circumstances to organize under. But always we've organized under difficult circumstances. So if you look at my previous shows that dealt with the choice between two cultures, I'm analyzing what the terrain is that we face now. Different from what King faced, though similar in certain respects. Different from what Malcolm faced, though similar in certain respects. And in the end, in all of them, in any organizing we're doing, the culture has to be tied to whatever the organizing is. Because some of our people now are operating a small number out of madness. They're doing things that we've never done before. And so culture is your curative in that. But your power center is where you are. And it's when you understand your power and when you got yourself together enough to make the right moves, not just organizing for anything, to make the right moves for change, that's the key thing. JB, kind of hard for me to chat and learn. If I don't chat, most likely I'm learning something new. Well, chat. But I mean, this is how this computer is working, because I'd like to have a situation where we could have direct thing. When we do the thing on the seminar, the webinar on sixfold stages to freeing the mind, there we'll be able to do direct interaction so we can get actual interplay coming from people. So I guess that's it. You know, it's a lot of hard work putting these shows together. I hope people who watch this show will subscribe. Encourage your friends to subscribe. This is extremely important. So next week, we'll be looking at Black Power in the 60s. So Hotep. Love you all. Y'all know that? Ain't nobody paying me for this. It could only be one thing. Huh? And one reason why you need to subscribe is there's some people who control some stuff out there. They don't like my message. And so I'm not even sure that I'm getting a count on everybody that subscribes. So subscribe. Hotep. See you next week.